Breathe, not in haste, not in fear, but with awareness. Because in this very moment, as air flows in and out of you, the miracle unfolds, one guarded for millennia by the ancient schools of wisdom. Breath is not merely life. It is revelation. You are about to enter a forgotten path, forgotten by many but remembered by the soul. A path that reveals that breathing is not a biological act, but a sacred bridge. A bridge between the material and the eternal, between man and the LOGOS, between the personal and the divine. Inspired by the arcane teachings of Helena Blavatsky, pioneer of modern theosophy and keeper of hidden knowledge, this text is not just information. It is invocation. It is guidance, and it is living spiritual practice. Here you will discover that breath is vibration, that every word is born of the word, and that the LOGOS, the cosmic intelligence, the source of order and meaning, has always been within reach through conscious breathing. This is not merely a journey of knowledge. It is a return to origin, an act of silent power, a communion. Breathe, and let the mystery begin. From the very first moments of human history, the act of breathing has remained so evident that its very obviousness made it invisible. However, in the most secret annals of the mystery schools, it is declared that no function constitutes such a direct key to deciphering the intimate relationship between the microcosm and the present treatise. This work does not aim to add another manual of breathing techniques to the bibliography of contemporary curiosity, but rather to restore the metaphysical architecture that sustains each inhalation and exhalation as living equations of creation. Here, the reader will find no promises of superficial well-being, nor formulas of psychological consolation. Instead, they will encounter the rigorous exposition of laws governing the continuous exchange between the monad and the universal substance. Laws which, once understood and applied, redirect the vector of consciousness from dispersion towards self-luminous unity. This volume is built upon the premise that breath, far from being limited to pulmonary dynamics, is the causal flow of the 7 primordial emanations of the LOGOS, the rhythms of Brahnia, and the seals that fix the post-mortem destiny of the thinking entity. Each chapter unfolds with the precision demanded by occult science, the diagrams linking the respiratory pause with temporality, the aureoled proportion of rhythm with the mechanics of the Manvantaras, and the reversal of the inhalation cycle with the inversion of the involutive force that dragged man away from his center. Archaic rites are also reviewed, through which a legitimate fraternity can transmit the internal fire by insufflation, and, as the initiatory oath allows awareness, the protocols are revealed that permit sealing the last breath to ensure the projection of Mechanica. Whoever ventures into these pages must do so with a spirit of sober inquiry, not emotional witchcraft. Every assertion is supported by the convergence of Egyptian, Tibetan, and Vedic sources. Every practice is presented within its cosmological context to prevent the fragmentary appropriation that has caused so much harm to the sacred sciences. If despite this the reader persists, they will discover that every breath they ignored is an operative bridge between their finite self and the intelligence pulsating behind all forms. Then they will understand why the ancients taught that mastering the breath is equivalent, in the most literal sense, to seizing the key to their own genesis and their own eschatology. The Era of God, based on Helena Blavatsky. We have noticed that more than 80% of visitors to our channel are not subscribed. You can support this project by pressing the subscribe button and liking the video. Thank you for inspiring us to continue creating more and better content for you. Are you ready to transform your life? Chapter 1. The primordial rupture and the first breath of the fallen man. It is not at the moment of biological conception that the soul truly enters the chain of birth, but rather at the vibratory threshold of the first autonomous breath. When the monad, already invested with the lower veils of the tripartite soul, accepts the prison of the body and allows itself to be dragged by the whirlwind of becoming, until the instant in which the breath is inhaled for the first time from the external world, the spiritual entity remains linked to the inner spheres through an intermediary still not entirely severed. But at the precise moment when the child, that being still without a true name, without fully activated karma, inhales on its own, the essential rupture is consummated. The separation from the Absolute becomes irreversible, at least within the margins of a corporeal existence. This respiratory act is not, as exoteric science maintains, simply a biological function. It is truly the inscription of a pact. Just as the adept, upon reaching certain degrees, breathes differently because their being no longer feeds on common oxygen but on the etheric, the involuntary neophyte, the infant by inhaling their first breath, signs on the physical plane their entry into the domain of Mara, the lord of time and illusion. The cry emitted by the newborn is not merely a nervous system response. It is the acoustic vibration that fixes in the surrounding ether the keynote of their incarnation. That note, perceptible to those who can hear the sounds of the fourth dimension, corresponds to a frequency that summarizes their karmic past and prefigures their cycle of trials. Before that moment, the soul is sustained by the umbilical cord, a triple essence structure, physical, etheric, and causal, that keeps it united to the maternal matrix, the ultimate symbol of unity before dispersion. Beyond its material function of nutrient and oxygen exchange, the cord is, in its hidden aspect, a thread of the Sutratma, the thread of the soul that links existences into a single rosary. Its cutting during physical childbirth, although necessary, constitutes a brief metaphysical violence. On the dense plane, the active reminiscence of the One, there is no birth without wound, and the blood that flows is not only vital fluid but sacred ink with which the pact of forgetting is rewritten. The placenta, which medical science dismisses as a useless organ once its biological function is fulfilled, is in reality a relic of the first sphere. Its form reflects the archetypal model of the tree of life, and its substance, though physical, contains vibrational impressions of the collective karma of the mother and the neophyte. The amniotic fluid, on the other hand, is the maternal ether that envelops the embryo in a state of consciousness similar to that of the lunar spheres, without concrete thought, without language, without ego. That fluid from which the child detaches at birth is the last veil separating them from the vibratory world of the devas of gestation, entities responsible for protecting the descent of the soul. Once exposed to the external world, the neophyte's body begins an irreversible process of densification. With the first breath, the soul accepts the limits of space and time. Its consciousness, which until then floated in a state of undifferentiated presence, becomes trapped in the linear axis of causality. And here is where what the ancient Gnostics called the katabasis is consummated, the descent into the lower worlds. It is not a moral fall, but an ontological one. The being falls into time, and thereby into the illusion of separation. This fall is also an involuntary initiation, for it reproduces in inverted form the mystery that the adept experiences when consciously dying. In both cases, there is a state transition, a rupture of continuity. But while the initiate voluntarily dies to form to reintegrate into the One, the infant involuntarily is born from the One into multiplicity, and in this process a polarity inversion is established. What was spirit becomes flesh. What was eternity becomes sequence. What was wholeness becomes fragment. Why then is this fall allowed? Why must one cross this rupture, this initial pain, this loss of the primordial breath? Because without the experience of limitation, there is no overcoming. Without descent, there is no return. Just as metal must be melted and separated from the dross, the soul must be confronted with illusion in order to awaken and overcome it. Breathing, therefore, is not merely a vital function, it is a sacrament. Each inhalation is a renewed acceptance of the world. Each exhalation an unconscious attempt at return. But only the one who turns their breathing into art, science, and mysticism can redeem the act of having been born. The ancient temples of Egypt and Chaldea taught that the soul should not enter the body unprepared. Thus, secret rituals existed aimed at preserving, at least partially, the memory of unity. Some neophytes were trained in the maternal womb through silent mantras, resonances the mother mentally emitted to engrave in the fetal body the vibration of the hidden name. Others underwent ritual immersions in sacred essences, so that their first contact with the physical world was tempered by the vibrations of higher elements. Today, these sciences are lost or ridiculed, but the law remains. Those who aspire to high initiation must consciously relive the moment of their first breath, decipher their keynote, and reconcile themselves with the rupture. Only then can they begin to breathe anew, not as a fallen being, but as a child of the Logos. Breath is, therefore, the energetic signature of the soul. No creature breathes like another. In the occult schools of the East, the master recognizes the disciple by the way they breathe, not by their words or gestures, because breathing is the mirror of the soul. Everything is in it. The intensity of aspiration reveals the hidden desire. The regularity of its flow shows the degree of internal harmony. The depth of its exhalation denotes the detachment achieved. Here, reader, is the principle of this sacred science. You do not breathe by instinct, you breathe by pact, and until you remember that pact, you will continue to breathe like a prisoner. But if you find the path back to the first breath, if you manage to transmute your mechanical breathing into a sacred act, you will have begun the path of return to the One. Chapter 2. The Breath Body. Invisible architecture of the psychic pneuma. The visible body of man is but the outer shell of a much vaster system, a subtle architecture that sustains, informs, and regulates his entire existence, even when he remains unaware of it. This subtle body, which Egyptian hieroglyphs called K, and which in other traditions has been translated with varying degrees of accuracy as the spiritual body, etheric vehicle, or breathing form, constitutes the archetypal mold upon which incarnate life is built. But what profane knowledge ignores, and what even many malformed esotericists only suspect vaguely, is that this body does not live by itself. It breathes, and its breathing is not limited to inhaling common air, but rather it constitutes a constant absorption of the invisible energies of the cosmos through secret channels whose existence remains hidden to ordinary senses. These channels, which wisdom calls nadis, are neither nerves nor vessels nor material filaments. They are lines of force, pathways of energetic transmission, etheric projections that connect the internal centers of being with the higher realms of universal life. The best known of these channels is the Sushumna, which runs along the central axis of the body, aligned with the spinal column, but situated on a subtler plane, invisible to the physical eye, though detectable by those whose perception has been purified through occult training. On each side of the Sushumna flow twin currents called Ida and Pingala, symbolizing the lunar and solar poles of the human being, whose rhythmic alternation governs the totality of the inner breathing. It is fundamental here to establish a strict differentiation between terms that, out of ignorance or superficiality, are often used as synonyms: air, breath, pneuma, and life. Air is the physical element composed of known gases, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, etc., and perceptible by the external senses. It is the lower vehicle, the dense shadow of a higher reality. Breath, on the other hand, is the internal manifestation of the respiratory function, the movement that connects the outer world with the inner world, not only physiologically, but metaphysically. The pneuma, or in its Greek form, pneuma in Sanskrit, prana in Hebrew, ruach, is the vital force channeled through breath, but not dependent on it. It is prior, subtler, and more determinative. Finally, life is the principle that animates, sustains, and directs the entirety of being. It is not energy, not movement, not vibration. It is will, creation stemming from the Logos. The error of profane science has been to reduce life to a biochemical function, and the error of many pseudo-esoteric schools has been to elevate prana to the category of divinity, ignoring that it is but a servant of the spirit. Prana is to life what sunlight is to the central fire of the cosmos, its peripheral expression. and as such, it can be manipulated, absorbed and directed, but not created by man. The breath body, the K, is the instrument that allows this interaction. Without it, the flesh would be inert and the soul a spectator without connection. This spiritual breathing body possesses its own organs, its own regulatory systems, and its own rhythms. Just as the lungs of the physical body expand and contract, so too does the K breathe, dilate and contract according to the forces passing through it. But its rhythm is not determined by physical will, nor biological automatism, but by the harmony among thoughts, emotions, and the central intention of the soul. When thought is pure, the K expands easily and absorbs large amounts of refined prana. When desire becomes dense, the breath body contracts, and its channels become obstructed, generating disharmonies that over time manifest as physical diseases or degenerative emotional states. In ancient Tibet, initiates were trained from childhood to perceive the subtle breath, a form of breathing that does not correspond to the in and out flow of air, but to an energetic oscillation passing through the hidden chakras, not the popular ones distorted by exoteric Orientalism, but the real ones connected to the highest levels of being. These centers, the upper Anahata, the internal Vishuddha, and the deep Ajna, are not colored points or luminous disks, but stations of consciousness, vibrational condensations that allow the passage of higher energies into denser planes. The training consisted of moving consciousness from physical air toward the inner breath until the physical body became unnecessary as a reference point for the experience of life. The breathing of the K does not require lungs, but does require purity. Hence, all internal alchemy texts insist on the need for chastity, clear thought, and truthful speech, because all of these affect the quality of prana absorbed and distributed. An impure word, a lie, a thought contaminated by hatred or selfish desire poisons not only the astral body, but also the breath of the breath body. And when it becomes intoxicated, consciousness becomes trapped in the lower planes of desire. It is not possible to master the hidden breath without first purifying the soul's vehicles. Anyone aspiring to awaken the channels must have cleansed their life of internal impurities. Otherwise, they will only open portals to forces that will destroy them. Therefore, the ancient mystery schools imposed years of silence and self-observation before even teaching the first breathing formulas, because each inhalation of the divine prana is also a responsibility. One cannot breathe fire without being consumed by it. In Chaldean texts, it was taught that the K must be nourished by solar breath. They did not refer to the physical sun, but to the spiritual sun, the invisible center of life radiating from the Buddhic plane. Only those who align their breathing with the rhythm of that sun, through contemplation, silent prayer, and the practice of stillness, can begin to activate the highest levels of the breath body. Then and only then do the channels of the nadi open, and pure prana, called in the secret tradition the breath of the white dragon, begins to flow. The physical body is the shadow, the K is the mold, life is the fire, and breath is the bridge between the three. The disciple who understands this will know there is no more important act in his day than the first and last conscious breath he takes. Because in those moments, it is decided whether the breath body is nourished or fades away, whether the soul rises or sinks, whether the pact with the Logos is renewed or forgotten. Chapter 3. The pause that touches the eternal, respiratory voids and metaphysical time. In the unfolding of human breathing, the untrained eye perceives only two obvious movements, inhalation and exhalation. However, for the esoteric consciousness, these two gestures barely constitute the superficial movement of the incarnated soul. The secret key, the point where visible reality dissolves into the invisible, does not lie in the breath itself, but in what happens between breaths. In those interstices, imperceptible to profane thought but luminous to the eye of the initiate, lies the crack that connects this world with the higher worlds. For there, in the breathless instant, the flow of psychological time stops, and the passage opens to the eternal present that sustains all states of existence. This pause, known among solar yogis as kumpaka neutral, is not the same void caused by the forced holding of air. It is not a physiological apnea, nor a simple respiratory delay. It is a moment of suspension that is neither voluntary nor involuntary, but supravoluntary. It is the spontaneous cessation of breath movement when consciousness aligns with its original source. It is not the body that holds the air, but the soul that suspends its need for movement. This type of pause, when reached, reveals the first form of contact with the Akasha plane, the primordial etheric substance where all acts, thoughts, and resonances of the cosmos are inscribed. Esoteric Buddhism describes this phenomenon with the term kasha, a word whose common translation as instant is insufficient and misleading. Kasha is more than a unit of time. It is the interval between two perceptions, two thoughts, two movements of the soul. It is the moment when the mental flow halts and the consciousness, freed from its discursive reflection, can contemplate reality without veil. In breathing, these kashas coincide with the pause that occurs just after exhalation and just before inhalation, or vice versa. They are gates that do not open by will, but by inner resonance. When the disciple silences their desire to control and surrenders the breath to the rhythm of the cosmos, these gates open on their own like flowers at the dawn of silence. Time, as experienced by the common man, is nothing more than a sequence of events tied by memory. But on the hidden plane, time is a vibratory structure. Each event has its resonance, frequency, color, and subtle form. These events do not occur one after the other, but unfold simultaneously in the Akashic field. To access that field, it is not necessary to travel through time, but to suspend the compulsion of becoming. The respiratory void creates the internal conditions for consciousness to leave the chronological axis and enter the vertical axis of the eternal. Now, in the ancient Vedic schools existed a science that today has been completely forgotten by modern yoga doctrines, the inverted hamsa. This practice did not consist in chanting the mantra soham in rhythm with the breath, as contemporary practitioners do, but in dissolving the polarities of the breath until the duality between soham, I am that, and hamsa, that am I, collapsed into pure non-identity. The inverted hamsa neither affirmed nor denied anything. It suspended judgment, thought, and desire. And in that suspension, the initiate could hear, not with the physical ear, but with the ear of the soul, the primordial sound, the anahata nada, which is not an emitted sound, but a sound that is the training to reach these states. This training is neither mechanical nor physiological. It is not enough to practice breath retention exercises. What is required is purity of intention, clarity of thought, and internal stillness. Each time the body enters spontaneous respiratory pause, the soul is invited to cross a threshold. But if the soul is distracted, disturbed, or full of desire, it will not perceive the threshold, and the void will close. That is why ancient yogis focus less on respiratory control and more on mind vigilance and heart purification. The void between breaths is also a mirror. It shows the disciple what they truly are, without adornments, concepts, or projections. There is no image to hold on to, no thought to cling to. Only the naked being remains before being. Whoever is not willing to contemplate themselves without mask will not endure that void, because there is no refuge possible in it except the Absolute. And that Absolute can only be reached by those who have destroyed everything that is not it. In the internal practices of Vajrayana Buddhism, visualization of the internal winds, lung in Tibetan, is used, stopping at the center of the heart where the indestructible drop of being, Bindu, resides. This drop is the direct reflection of the higher self and can only be seen when the winds cease. This cessation occurs briefly in the pause between breaths, but, if prolonged through proper practice, can lead the disciple to the state of formless samadhi, where time disappears and consciousness merges with its origin. Whoever has experienced this state no longer breathes as before. Their breathing becomes slower, deeper, and more conscious. They need less air because they nourish themselves from pure prana, and because their consciousness no longer clings to external movement. They live more in the interval than in the act, and it is in that interval where the soul's destiny is forged. The initiate knows that all true transformation occurs in the void, not in movement, but in the suspension of movement. Just as the silence between notes gives meaning to music, the void between breaths gives meaning to life. Each respiratory pause is an opportunity to return to the origin, to remember what has been forgotten, to listen to what can only be spoken in the non-word. And so, dear reader, I invite you to observe your next breath, not as a physical act, but as a rite. Do not rush to inhale or exhale. Allow the pause to manifest. Dwell in that void, and perhaps, if your soul is mature and your mind silent, you will perceive the echo of the eternal whispering to you from beyond time. Chapter 4. The Secret of Rhythm, Breath and the Architecture of the Universes. Everything in the cosmos, from the most imperceptible subatomic vibration to the spinning of galaxies, is subject to an unchanging universal law, the law of rhythm. Nothing remains static. Everything pulses, oscillates, contracts, and expands according to a hidden archetype that is not only vibrational, but intelligently geometric. What the ancient sages understood, and what modern science is only beginning to suspect, is that this cosmic pulsation is no different from human breathing. Man, the living microcosm, reproduces in his breath the respiration of the brahmacharya, the egg of the world. To breathe, therefore, is not simply to keep the body alive. It is to attune oneself to the breath of Brahman itself, the architect of the manifested universe. In the oldest texts of Vedanta, it is said that Brahma breathes once, and in that breath occurs a manvantara, the duration of a complete creation. When he exhales, the universe expands. When he inhales, the universe contracts. Each exhalation corresponds to an emission of the visible cosmos, a manifestation of forms, beings, worlds, and laws. Each inhalation corresponds to a return to the unmanifest state, a withdrawal of all into the night of divine consciousness. Thus the cycles of creation and dissolution are but the rhythms of a being that breathes eternally. Understanding this reveals that all creation is a breath of the Absolute, and that every return is an inhalation of divinity upon itself. Applied to the human being, this principle shows that breathing is not only biological but symbolic and theurgic. When man exhales, he externalizes energy, manifests in the world, acts, projects. When he inhales, he gathers, internalizes, assimilates, reflects. But beyond this basic interpretation, there is a hidden pattern in the duration of each respiratory cycle. A pattern which, if respected, allows the soul to resonate with the universal rhythm. This pattern is neither arbitrary, cultural, nor aesthetic. It is rooted in sacred proportions encoded since the dawn of time. The ideal duration of the respiratory cycle for the theurgic neophyte, not the profane man nor the accomplished adept, but the conscious aspirant to the mystery, is based on the golden ratio, the mathematical expression closest to cosmic harmony. The ratio 1.618 that governs the spiral of galaxies, the growth of leaves, the structure of DNA, and the architecture of ancient temples. It also regulates the relationship between inhalation, retention, exhalation, and the new pause. The perfect rhythm occurs when the inhalation lasts 5 units, the retention 8, the exhalation 5, and the final pause 8, or any exact multiple of this proportion. This cycle, taught secretly in the ashrams of the Himalayas, is known as the rhythm of the inner fire, because it activates in the soul a fire that is not cellular combustion, but the divine intelligence burning without consuming. Whoever breathes this way, even if only for brief moments, establishes a vibrational bridge with the rhythms of the causal plane. And that resonance is not only energetic, but transformative. It is not simply relaxation or health as exoteric systems claim, but ontological reconfiguration. The Manvantaras, cycles of cosmic creation, and the Pralayas, cycles of dissolution, have their exact equivalents in human breathing. The Manvantara is the cycle of conscious activity, the exhalation of vital energy into the world. The Pralaya is the suspension, the inhalation, and the silence. Each day of Brahma contains 1,000 cycles of creation. Each night contains as many of return. Yes, even the neophyte who practices conscious breathing for 1,000 cycles a day, approximately every 2 minutes during a theoretical 33 hours, which in spiritual practice is coded as the symbolic day, is performing an exact reflection of Brahma's rhythm. This practice, carried out over 12 lunar years, a cycle of Surya Siddhanta, reconstructs the inner temple and opens the direct channel to the fire of the nose. The thurgic respiratory rhythm also regulates the flow of the tattvas, the elemental vibrations of ether that enter and exit the auric field. Each tattva, Akasha, Vayu, Tejas, Apas, Prithivi, has its particular rhythm of manifestation. The one who breathes unconsciously receives the tattvas in disorder, and their field becomes contaminated by discordant vibrations. But the one who aligns their rhythm with that of the brahmacharya makes the tattvas enter harmoniously, like musical notes in a divine symphony. This restores the balance of the vital field, activates the centers of inner perception, and in advanced cases allows predicting the movements of life, just as the sage reads the signs of the sky. The hidden geometry of breathing also manifests in the shape of the vibrational patterns around the body when the rhythm is correct. In advanced practices, the disciple can visualize how the breath forms mandalas of light in their etheric field, perfect spirals that turn from the center of the heart toward the edges of the aura in sync with the pulses of the cosmos. These respiratory mandalas, known by the ancient Egyptians as the seals of Ankh, were used to tune into stellar temples and activate the soul's memories. Therefore, sincere reader, do not underestimate your breath as a mere animal reflex. In each cycle of your breath plays an echo of creation and universal dissolution. Breathing is dancing with the gods. It is entering the heartbeat of the all. It is writing with your own body the symphony of worlds. And so when you inhale, remember that you are gathering the dissolved worlds of Pralaya. When you exhale, you participate in the creation of the Manvantara. And when you pause between them, you return to the womb of the unmanifest where there is no form, no name, no time. Chapter 5. The 7 Logos breaths and the breaths of the Adept. At the heart of all manifestation, before forms arose, even before the planes of existence unfolded, there was a breath. Not a physical breath nor a current of air, but a primordial emanation of the ineffable will, the unmanifested Logos, who ceaselessly projected from its center 7 differentiated vibrations. These 7 breaths, known among the Atlantean sages as Hashbua and Elohim, the 7 breaths of the one God, are the 7 archetypal forms through which being expresses itself on all levels of existence. Each of these breaths corresponds to a plane of consciousness, to a principle of being, to a quality of the divine fire, and the most hidden and dangerous to reveal, to a specific breathing of the soul that the adept must consciously reactivate if they wish to reintegrate with the origin. The 7 breaths are not allegories or mystical qualities. They are real, structured, defined, and operative vibrational currents that penetrate the substance of all planes, from the ADI to the physical modulating states of matter, rhythms of the soul, and the disposition of invisible energy centers that the profane confuse with the so-called chakras popularized and distorted by the false teachings of this dark cycle. The adept who works with these breaths does not seek to awaken powers or heal the body. Their sole purpose is to reintegrate each of their principles with the corresponding ray of the Logos until the entirety of their being vibrates as a perfect octave in the symphony of the One. The first breath, linked to the ADI plane, the primordial fire, is the breathing of the full void. It involves neither inhalation nor exhalation, but the absolute suspension of breath in the black light of non-being. It is used only by those who have crossed the third major initiation and whose consciousness is no longer anchored in the causal body. This breath cannot be learned. It manifests spontaneously when the soul merges with its Atman. The second breath, emanating from the Anupadaka plane, the archetypes of being, is the radial breathing. Here, breath does not move linearly, but spherically. Each inhalation expands from the center toward the periphery of the auric body. Each exhalation returns in a concentric spiral to the subtle heart. This breathing allows the adept to anchor in their monadic center and project consciousness beyond the plane of abstract thought. It is practiced in the inner retreats of Kalapa through a hidden mudra that activates the ring of Shambhala. The third breath corresponds to the atmic plane and is called the breathing of the column. In it, breath ascends and descends through the internal channel of the real susumna, not the anatomical or imagined one, carrying the energy of the higher will through the 7 centers of the hidden body. This practice can only be performed once the etheric vehicle has been purified and strengthened by the fire of internal discipline. This breathing generates a silent sound, perceived as a high-frequency buzzing in the center of the skull, and is an unequivocal sign of the awakening of the atmic principle. The fourth breath on the Buddhic plane of pure intuition is the breathing of union. It is an inhalation without center, where the soul breathes not through an organ, but through the totality of the field of consciousness. Breath here neither enters nor exits, but permeates the entire being as a sacred substance. Its practice requires the destruction of identification with the individual self, and can only be maintained if the soul has been trained in silent contemplation for at least 3 uninterrupted lunar years. The fifth breath, an emanation from the higher mental plane, is the luminous breathing. Its rhythm aligns with the geometry of the subtle dodecahedron and activates the hidden centers behind the brow, in the occipital region, and at the base of the skull. This breathing allows the reception of pure archetypal ideas that the adept must then translate without distortion into the lower plane. It is the breath used in the acts of theurgical writing, sacred transmission, and non-verbal communication between initiates. The sixth breath, related to the higher astral plane, is the breathing of the waters. It is an undulating breath that fluctuates like the tides, synchronized with the internal lunar rhythms. This breathing balances the higher emotional principle and allows the cleansing of lower desires that may still disturb the adept's astral body. In the retreats of Kalapa, this type of breathing is practiced during the exact hour of lunar transit and requires simultaneous contemplation of a liquid geometric figure called the sigil of the unperturbed lake. Finally, the seventh breath, the emanation realized in the physical etheric plane, is the breathing of the incarnate word. Here breath synchronizes with internal sound, so that each breath invokes a vibratory quality of the LOGOS. This breathing is rhythmic, sonorous, and accompanied by sealed formulas, mantras not spoken but thought from the navel to the upper palate. Mastery of it allows the adept to channel the densest energies of the LOGOS into the physical world, generating acts of power that can alter matter, heal, or transform collective vibrations. To align these 7 breaths with the 7 hidden centers, not the chakras adulterated by modern doctrines, but the true seals of the inner planes, the adept must perform a combined practice, uniting breathing, mudra, geometric visualization, and contemplation. Each center responds to a type of breath and is activated not by concentration, but by tuning. These centers, distributed in the etheric field as vertices of a non-Euclidean heptagon, are portals to the 7 rays of the LOGOS, and their sequential opening transforms the body into a living temple. Thus, reader, you will understand that not all breaths are the same. It is not enough to breathe consciously. One must breathe with science, with ritual, with awareness of the planes and principles. Each breath can be an invocation to the One if executed with precision and devotion, or it can be a sigh lost in ignorance if lived without understanding. And you breathe either as an echo of the Logos or as a leaf carried by the wind of desire. Chapter 6. Breathing as language, the breath and the sacred no word. Man believes he communicates through words, articulated sounds which, when grouped according to conventions, convey meaning. Yet the hidden reality is different. Before spoken language, even before verbal thought, there existed a pure form of communication, a direct invocation between consciousness and the principle, the language of breath. Breathing is not merely a physiological function, nor just a means of absorbing vital energy. At its deepest essence, it is a mode of vibrational emission, a language without phonemes that communicates from soul to universal soul. In the mysteries of the word, which formed the core of Pythagorean instruction and the essence of the Amun rite at Karnak, it was taught that every breath a human emits is an unspoken phrase, an inaudible syllable, an affirmation of their inner state. Every human being, even in silence, speaks, not with the tongue, but with the air they release. Breath is charged with intention, rhythm, and subtle form. The monad, in its original state, did not communicate with words, but with respiratory impulses that were perceived by other monads as immediate understandings. This language, preceding the verb, has not vanished. It lies buried within the folds of deep consciousness, and only the adept who has purified their mind can recall it. The wise of the Atlantean tradition knew this breath language. They called it the internal mental breath, and stated it was the tongue of the first builders, the Manasaputras, before language fragmented into forms. It was this language that gave rise to archaic mantras, root sounds not invented by humans, but direct imitations of certain cosmic vibrations perceived during states of spiritual absorption. Thus were born the Bisharas, sound seeds such as Om Hum Terim Fat, which have no literal translation because they do not convey concepts, but vibrational structures that shape consciousness. But even these pronounced mantras are only an outer layer. The true vibration is not found in the sound, but in the accompanying respiratory gesture. Therefore, true mantras are not recited only with the mouth, but with the body of breath. Vocal emission is merely the sound shadow of an inner gesture. This is why the highest schools of Deccan and Sahayana employed what they called the voice without voice, a silent intonation made solely with intention and breath, where vibration is generated in the heart center and expands into the etheric field. This breath language is structured into what initiates know as patterns of silent invocation. Each pattern consists of a sequence of breaths combining rhythm, intensity, and duration, generating a subtle form on the higher astral plane. These forms, called respiratory logograms, are the true letters of the hidden alphabet, invisible to physical eyes but perceptible to the trained soul. An advanced adept can read a disciple's inner state not by their words but by the quality of their breath, its temperature, vibration, direction, because each breath is an energetic confession. In this context, one understands what ancient traditions called the lost word. It is not a forgotten word nor a lost magical formula, as some degenerate Rosicrucians believe, but the lost capacity to emit sacred breath as an act of creation. The lost word is consecrated breath, the exhalation that creates forms on the etheric plane according to pure will. Recovering it means restoring mankind's myurgic power, not creating from matter, but from vibrational intention. In the deepest practices of the Kalapa retreats, the breathing of the unspoken name is taught. It consists of inhaling while concentrating on the impersonal aspect of the Logos, and exhaling, feeling its manifestation within oneself, without emitting sound. Sustained for months, this practice reveals the original phonemic root, not as sound but as direct understanding of the inner name. When the disciple breathes thus, they begin to hear within themselves the silent voice that orders the worlds. It is neither hallucination nor metaphor, but the direct perception of the verb in its pure vibrational state. The difference between vocalized breathing and unvoiced breathing is as radical as the difference between symbol and reality. The first communicates outwardly, generates audible vibrations, can be repeated, taught, memorized. The second communicates inwardly, creates internal resonances that modify the soul's structure, and can only be transmitted by energetic contact. Vocalization belongs to the world of forms. Unvoiced breathing belongs to the world of principles. In Egypt, the Hierophants taught that the soul had to learn to speak without voice before being admitted to the temple's fourth veil. There, every word was sacrilege. Only breath could express the inexpressible. Temples were built according to invisible acoustic patterns, so that simple breathing within the sanctuary generated harmonic resonances. These temples were sacred breathers, and those who dwelled within learned to speak with their breath. So, reader, do not underestimate the silent act of breathing. Each of your exhalations is a word the world hears, even if you do not pronounce it. What are you saying with your breath? What are you sending to the cosmos? Beyond your conscious thoughts, you have learned to keep silent with your tongue and speak with your soul. Breathe not only to live, breathe to invoke, breathe to remember, breathe to listen to what is said only in silence. Chapter 7. The Holy Spirit and the Hierophant's Breath. Transmission of the breath of life. The exoteric tradition has perpetuated, distorted, and mutilated a truth whose depth and sacredness once formed the living core of the mysteries, the transmission of the inner fire through the consecrated breath. What dogma calls Pentecost, and what ecclesiastical texts recount as the descent of tongues of fire and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit upon the disciples, is but the faint shadow of an archaic rite that predates the birth of historical Christianity, with roots stretching from Iran to the Himalayas in the schools of the solar fire. What is described there should not be understood as a miracle, but as the culmination of an initiatory process, the direct contact between the divinized breath of the Hierophant and the prepared monad of the disciple. There is no true transmission that does not pass through breath. All knowledge received through word, symbol, or reading remains a mere reflection. Only when the soul enters into vibratory communion with the breath of a being who has kindled the flame of the one within themselves does true initiation occur. This transmission happens neither by the will of the transmitter nor by the desire of the receiver. It takes place when inner conditions align, when the disciple's channel has been opened through purification, and when the Hierophant acts not as an individual, but as the emitter of the will of the Logos. The initiatory act of insufflation is older than all religions. The Mithraists called it the second insufflation and practiced it in inner retreats, beyond the reach of the profane, in chambers where the breath of the world was suspended. There the Hierophant stood before the neophyte, and after a prolonged phase of absolute silence, projected a single breath, not with the lungs, but from the heart center, onto the disciple's face, brow, or chest. This breath was not air, but a directed vibration, charged with a superhuman intention and endowed with the fiery quality of the Spirit. In some cases, the disciple would enter a deep trance. In others, they felt the immediate rupture of their false identity. The essential effect was not emotional, but a vibratory internal reconfiguration, which only revealed itself in the days or weeks that followed. The Aptanic texts belonging to the tradition of the 7 rishis also speak of this act, placing it in an even more ancient context. The first emanation of prana, by Manu, upon those who would become his spiritual heirs. There it is taught that the breath of life is not received at birth, but at the second birth, and that this second birth occurs not when man understands, but when he breathes from the eternal source. This event is described as prancha dikima, consecration by breath, and is considered the true beginning of spiritual life. Without it, all knowledge is mere preparation. With it, life itself becomes the teacher. But this act has been misunderstood, degraded, and ultimately forgotten. The apostolic insufflation, as it appears in canonical texts, is a pale echo of what was truly an archaic initiatory gesture. When the supposed risen Christ breathes the Holy Spirit upon his disciples, the Gospels veil an esoteric truth. the transmission of the vibration of the perfected adept to his conscious heirs. But the way this scene has been interpreted as a moral symbol or an inexplicable miracle has killed its essence. What truly occurred was an act of respiratory theurgy, the Logos breathing into prepared vessels the fire of its vital current. The Holy Spirit, thus understood, is not a Trinitarian third person, but the fire of the universal breath, prancha in its solarized form, which can only be channeled by those whose inner structure has been purified. It is the same fire the Mithraists represented as a golden serpent coiled in the center of the chest, and which the Aptarniks described as the white wind blowing from the etheric north toward the monad's axis. To breathe this fire is impossible without having symbolically died, that is, without having destroyed the identity based on the lower ego. The Hierophant's breath cannot dwell in a house still filled with human smoke. The ceremony of the second insufflation requires very specific conditions. The environment must be free of dissonant resonances. The atmosphere must be charged with harmonic vibrations, whether through hidden sound, geometric visualization, or mental irradiation, and the disciple's body must be prepared through pranic fasting, prolonged silence, and rhythmic breathing. In some hidden temples of Central Asia, this ceremony was performed only at equinoxes, when the solar gate allowed alignment between the adept's causal plane and the neophyte's auric field. No word is spoken during the rite. All is performed with directed breath. The Hierophant emits 3 types of breath: the breath of purification, the breath of ignition, and the breath of union. The first dissolves discordant vibrations. The second activates the soul center. The third establishes a permanent channel between the disciple's higher self and the focus of the Logos. From that moment, the initiate no longer breathes for himself, but his breath becomes part of the rhythm of the world soul. Transmission by breath is irreversible. Once received, the fire cannot be extinguished. Even if the disciple falls, they will remain as a hidden spark, a latent fire, waiting to be rekindled. And that spark, if cultivated rightly, can become a torch capable of illuminating others. Therefore, reader, if you ever feel in your chest a breath that is not yours, a breath passing through you without your generation, do not fear. It may be the memory of your ancient initiation or the presence of a master wishing to breathe fire into you. Still your mind, silence your voice, and let the Spirit breathe where it wills. Chapter 8. Stopping time, breathing immortality, and the cutting of the karmic chain. From the peaks of the Himalayas to the silent cloisters of the Deccan, it has been whispered from generation to generation that time is a breath. Such a statement is not a mere metaphorical license. It is a technical description of the very fabric of phenomenal existence, becoming the succession of moments that the profane mind experiences as before and after, is sustained by an incessant concatenation of acts of perception called eskandas in esoteric psychology. Each time consciousness breathes, and here breathing transcends the pulmonary, it updates a portion of its past, legitimizes a project for its future, and preserves the inertia of its illusory identity. If that matrix breath is suspended, the eskandas lose their support. The karmic mechanism disengages, and time, as linear experience, extinguishes like a lamp without oil. The secret records of various Tibetan fraternities designate this operation as the suspension of internal time. The term does not refer to an external phenomenon, for the mountains continue their orography and the stars persist in their orbits, but rather to the interruption of the subjective flow that makes becoming a prison. To reach such a state, the disciple must first master what the lamas describe as hypergeometric breaths, rhythms that do not obey the simple arithmetic of alternating inhalation and exhalation, but more complex proportions based on Pythagorean relations, replicating the hidden architecture of the Platonic solids. Each respiratory cycle is shaped as a polyhedron, whose edges are units of duration. When the last edge seals, an instant of absolute suspension arises, the metaphysical vertex where consciousness can slip out of the temporal mesh. To understand the mechanism, it is worth recalling that time does not exist independently of the consciousness that experiences it. The Sanya treatises establish that kala is a modality of the mind, not an autonomous principle. When the mind sustains its series of representations, time flows. When its activity coagulates, the flow ceases. Now, breathing is the key that links mental movement with the vital circuit. A common respiratory rhythm maintains the stability of the pittis, but if that rhythm lengthens, shortens, and suspends following a determined geometry, internal representations become discontinuous, the pittis disintegrate, and the skandhas scatter like loose beads. At such a juncture, the karmic chain finds no platform on which to anchor its impulse, and consciousness peers into timelessness. The procedure begins with a preliminary phase called puntiswamana, calming the fluctuations. The aspirant isolated in a dark cell reduces their breathing to a quarter of its ordinary rhythm. When the mind has quieted and bodily sensations have lost sharpness, the hypergeometric pattern itself is introduced, whose most widely spread model among the Galupa masters follows the proportion 3-5-8-13, reflecting the spiral governing the development of the auric petals. The inhalation occurs in 3 counts, retention in 5, exhalation in 8, and the final pause in 13. These are not chronological seconds, but subjective units derived from the vital pulse. After 34 cycles, the number completing 3 internal spirals, an interval almost happens by itself, in which the body does not demand air, the heart beats once very weakly, and the temperature balances with the environment. This interval is the gate. It must not be prolonged forcefully, for the slightest tension would rekindle the ego's dynamics. The practitioner then experiences the perception of a silence whose texture differs from mere physical muteness. It is the cancellation of all succession. In that state, memories, expectations, and emotions neither fuse nor alternate. They simply have nowhere to manifest. Psychological time has been dismantled. If this void is maintained for 7 potential breaths, the number equivalent to the complete circumference of the causal aura, the adept carves a wedge into the karmic current, and although upon returning to waking life external chronology imposes itself again, something irreparable has occurred. The chain of cause and effect no longer operates automatically. Tantric scriptures warn, however, that this fracture does not imply the elimination of accumulated karma, but the transformation of its substrate. Latent impressions continue to exist, but their relation to consciousness has changed. They are seen as objects, not identity. Contemplated from the timeless pause, the adept can resolve them with discernment instead of compulsively reliving them. Thus is explained the paradoxical action of the immortal. They act in the world but are not swept away by it, preceding each gesture with the memory of that void where no gesture is necessary. Such is the power conferred by hypergeometric breathing. It does not grant cellular longevity, for matter follows its cycle, but it grants the real experience of immortality, which consists in dwelling in what neither arises nor dies. There are variants of the technique. In some Kanchenjunga ashrams, the proportion 4-7-11-18 is used, inspired by the structure of the Sri Yantra. Others prefer the series 2-3-5-8 for simplicity, but all agree on the crucial moment of holding the breath passively for 1 or 2 heartbeats, without the will to stop it. When that stopping is genuine, the practitioner perceives a high-pitched sound that does not vibrate in the physical ear. It is the reverberation of the Huabran in the inner ear. Even when breath flows again, that sound remains as proof that the mind has touched the threshold of the eternal. The risks are real. Forcing suspension without prior purity causes the energy contained in subtle channels to burst like dammed water, provoking nervous disorders, psychic disturbances, or in extreme cases, premature rupture of the life thread. For this reason, the practice is entrusted only to those who have demonstrated equanimity, discipline, and detachment, nor is frequent repetition of the phenomenon pursued. A single genuine experience suffices to loosen the karmic axis. From there, the disciple must cultivate mindfulness amidst ordinary life, responding to every stimulus without attachment, carrying these silent words into every inhalation and exhalation. This passes. I am before the passing. Some hagiographic accounts report cases of lamas who, having completely mastered the suspension of internal time, vanished from common perception for days, and upon return showed signs of rejuvenation. One must not conclude that biological aging reversed. What happened is that by denying nourishment to temporal consciousness, psychosomatic wear diminished, though cellular machinery continued its course. The immortality sought is not the permanence of form, but uninterrupted consciousness through all forms. The adept who cuts the karmic chain ceases to be so-and-so and becomes a participating witness of the universal dance, no longer confusing their essence with transient masks. Whoever aspires to these vertices must begin by observing a simple fact. Between each inhalation and each exhalation, there is a micro-void. It is not yet the great pause, but its embryo. Approach that threshold with an alert mind. Send your attention there as one sends a probe to the ocean floor. Discover how in that fissure time thins, then prolong the space without forcing it. Let it expand like a night flower. This will be the beginning of the alchemy that fuses breath and eternity. Ultimately, stopping time is not about mastering it, but discovering that there never was such a thing as time. Only breaths of consciousness reflected in countless mirrors. Whoever has seen thus is no longer a slave to internal or external clocks, knows that every moment can be a window to the timeless, and from that certainty can serve the world without being devoured by it, walking among men and gods with the lightness of one who carries in the secret of their chest the imperishable breath of Absolute Now. Chapter 9. Breathing from the Soul. Reversal of the falling process in the downward trajectory that culminates in physical incarnation. Human breathing adopts a clearly involutive vector. The lower self mainly inhales impressions from the external world, sensations, desires, stimuli, and exhales scattered spiritual energy that dissolves in the whirlpool of forms without redeeming them. With each such cycle, consciousness becomes accustomed to receiving from the periphery and losing from the center. Thus, it reinforces the illusion that the source of happiness lies outside itself rather than in inner fullness. This primary inversion occurred at the moment of the first breath already examined. The monad, detaching from the unitive matrix, internalized the idea that it must take from the environment to live. Since then, the breathing pattern of fallen humanity reproduces on a microcosmic scale the ancient deviation. Inhalation sucks in what it perceives as other, and exhalation expels what it considers its own, continuously emptying itself of its essence. The adept, upon recognizing this mechanism, undertakes a re-engineering of the breath, whose purpose is to restore the original meaning of the vital current. To do this, they consciously invert the direction of respiratory consciousness. They learn to inhale from the higher soul and exhale toward matter, baptizing it with the recovered light. This act does not consist of drawing air from some imaginary heavenly region. It involves shifting the point of attention to the causal plane, where the essential self resides, and allowing the inhalation to emerge from that supraspatial core, then descending along the inner axis down to the cells. Consequently, the exhalation is not waste, but radiation, a qualified flow of prana that penetrates bodily substance and, by magnetic projection, orders the vibration of the immediate environment. When this pattern stabilizes, the respiratory cycle closes upon itself, like the serpent biting its tail, symbol of energy that no longer disperses, but returns to its reconstituted and augmented source. To achieve such inversion, the first step is to dissolve the sensory compulsion that drives the chest to expand at every external stimulus. The disciple sits in a state of recollection, and becomes aware of the anxiety to inhale. That reflex, which seeks to grasp the object and drag it inward instead of following it, is allowed to extinguish for lack of grip. When the chest finally relaxes, a gentle breath arises from the depths, not from the lungs, but from a region the Upanishadic texts call Invita and Kasasya, the space of the heart. This ascending current penetrates the head, descends through the spine, and rises again, forming a luminous loop. The practitioner then perceives that they have breathed without taking anything. They have allowed the breath to spring forth from fullness rather than draw from lack. Once this flow is recognized, the phase of conscious radiation is introduced. During exhalation, instead of passively releasing the air, the adept directs the breath imbued with light toward the bloodstreams, nerves, and finally, the particles of the environment. There is no tension or effort. The radiation occurs as a natural overflow of the newly contacted fullness. Thus, each exhalation becomes a priestly act. It consecrates matter, transfers harmonic quality to objects and beings, and at the same time strengthens the ascending channel of the next inhalation, which will no longer depend on capturing external stimuli, but on reconnecting with the inner source. After some time, the cycle gains its own speed. Breathing from the soul becomes spontaneous, and breathing statically into the world becomes second nature. The geometric support of this process is the closed circuit of redemptive energy, represented as a lemniscate centered on the subtle heart. One lobe opens towards the causal plane, and the other projects towards the dense plane. The crossing point, coinciding with the etheric heart node, acts as a transmuter between the two hemispheres. While the involutive man makes the lemniscate pivot outward, losing strength with each turn, the initiate spins it inward, absorbing only the luminous substance of the soul and returning it to the world after quintessencing it. The visible result is an auric field no longer nourished by foreign emotions or environmental currents, but maintaining self-sustained brightness. Visible but real is the thinning of karmic threads, as the skandhas deprived of emotional reactivity find little surface to cling to and end up burning upon contact with the inner flame. To consolidate the reversal, the daily liturgical practice concludes with downward fixation. The adept remains silent, contemplates the matter of their body, and recognizes in it a portion of the Logos. Upon exhaling, they mentally affirm, "This too redeemed." Upon inhaling, they declare, "I am that realized." These are not psychological affirmations, but vibrational seals that reorient identification. Over time, breathing becomes a perpetual act of communion. The external world ceases to tyrannize attention and consciousness. Instead of ascending to escape, consciousness descends in an act of service, carrying light where it once absorbed shadow. The analogy of the Urubora serpent is enlightening here. The tail, symbol of coarse matter, is caught by the mouth, symbol of spirit, but not to devour it, which would imply dualistic destruction, but to close the circuit and transmute it without expulsion. In respiratory terms, the tail exhalation rushes outward only after being saturated by the soul-head essence, so that upon exiting it is not lost, but becomes an offering that reconfigures the environment. Thus the fall is reversed without denying form and matter, which, far from being enemies, become the territory of illumination. Whoever manages to live in this pattern, even without withdrawing from the world, will have interrupted the ontological hemorrhage that defined their mortal condition. They will continue to breathe air like any other human, but their true breath will circulate in a closed circuit of coherence, simultaneously nourishing soul and world. Such a person can truthfully affirm, "I live, but I do not live by myself. It is the Logos that breathes in me, and that Logos, traveling indefinitely the path from chest to cosmos and cosmos to chest, will have restored to the human microcosm the ascending direction it lost upon entering the flesh." Chapter 10. The Last Breath, Breathing and the Science of Conscious Death. The final hour, which for most takes the form of a biological collapse accompanied by sensory confusion, constitutes for the adept the supreme consecration of all their respiratory discipline. Throughout life, each cycle of inhalation and exhalation was a meticulous preparation for a decisive act, when consciousness, detaching from its pulmonary support, must project its vector toward the higher debashan, or, lacking direction, be reabsorbed by the whirlwind of rebirth. There is not a single treatise in the annals of profane sciences that addresses with the required precision the relationship between the last breath and the post-mortem trajectory of the monad. However, the sealed archives of Egypt, Chaldea, and Tibet preserve flow diagrams showing that the emission angle of the terminal pracha and the vibratory configuration of the so-called breath seal precisely determine, with mathematical accuracy, the curve the causal body will follow when leaving the etheric envelope. That curve, perceptible on planes unregistered by earthly optics, can be drawn as an ascending spiral of bacha, or as a closed helix that returns by karmic inertia to the astral gestation plane, where the conditions of the next incarnation will be modeled. In the ordinary involutive scheme, the mind, clouded by physical pain or attachment, clings to the retreating air and releases the last breath as chaotic exhalation. The vital current, lacking coherent signature, diffuses into the etheric environment and becomes prey to gravitic forces that drag it to the zone of unresolved memories. In contrast, the initiate operates exactly the opposite way. They do not expel the breath, but concentrate it in the cardiac region, refine it into a single point of white golden pracha, and launch it along the axis of the sutrasma like an arrow with no return. This procedure requires that the preceding breathing have adopted a progressively subtler pattern as the final moment approaches. During the last hours, air enters and leaves almost imperceptibly until the pause between inhalation and exhalation stretches enough for the adept to clearly perceive the threshold. It is then that the seal activates, a slight contraction of the internal glottis, sealing of the pelvic base, and a palatal mudra that adheres the tongue to the upper palate, closing the brain-heart plexus circuit. In this configuration, the remaining breath no longer leaves the body through the lungs, but is suctioned vertically along the etheric sushumna, passing through the crown and projecting, according to Indian tradition, to the gate of Brahman. This exit point, when coded with the correct vibration, acts as a conduit to the luminous spheres. The priest-builders of the Great Pyramid knew this transit and built the so-called ascension chamber not as a symbolic tomb, but as a respiratory resonator that amplified the final seal. Each initiable pharaoh spent their last hours there, lying on the basalt sarcophagus, whose sides were carved with acoustic cavities tuned to the fundamental tone of their stellar name. The sound produced by long wind trumpets vibrated at a frequency capable of synchronizing the heartbeat with the chamber's oscillation. When the breathing fell into perfect periodicity with that frequency, the adept sealed the breath inside the chest, did not exhale it, and transmuted it into a carrier wave which, according to Hermetic tablets, rode the light of Sau, the constellation we now call Orion, carrying them to the corridor of immortality. Hence, in pyramid texts, the repeated formula appears: "May your breath mingle with the wind of the gods, and your nose need no air." This was not a funerary metaphor, but a technical description of the supreme containment of pracha. Similar principles govern the Tibetan practice of the text. Final retreat, where prepared monks enter, days before vital functions cease, into a state of absorption that nearly suspends gas exchange. During this period, breathing reduces to an imperceptible filigree, and body temperature is maintained thanks to the internal combustion of Getum Mo, the psychic fire that provides energy without requiring external oxygen. When the hour comes, the guiding master pronounces the seed syllable corresponding to the practitioner's karmic essence. The practitioner, hearing it not with physical ears but with consciousness, retains the weak breath still circulating and concentrates it into the indestructible drop of the heart. In the next instant, liberation occurs without exhalation. Consciousness expands outside the body, and external signs of death, rigidity, lividity, take days to appear, as the vital link withdrew so cleanly that cellular decomposition is delayed. Witnesses often find the corpse odorless, with a serene face, and in extreme cases with volumetric reduction of the body, a phenomenon called sharira swinking, indicating that part of the mass sublimated along with the pracha. According to mystery schools, the breath seal possesses a triple vibratory coding: timbre, direction, and intention. The timbre is the particular frequency of pracha, shaped over years through internal vocalizations and rhythmic breathing. The direction is the psychophysical vector, pointing to the preselected pole of debashan, for there are strata of that region suitable to the quality of each soul. Intention is the pure noetic component, designating the ultimate motive of the journey. When these three parameters are coherent, the breath becomes a password that opens the corresponding sphere. If one fails, consciousness wanders through intermediate levels and ultimately reintegrates into the wheel of rebirths. Hence the insistence of ancient theurgic manuals that the adept mentally recite, in moments preceding the transit, the self-identification formula: "I am the gate and the wind, in me the path opens, in me it closes." Repeated with full attention during the last 100 heartbeats, this phrase acts as a calibrator of the seal. It is not pronounced with lips, which by then no longer articulate clearly, but with the breath itself vibrating in profound silence. The air trapped between lungs and trachea resonates in the cranial cavity like a subtle bell. Crossing the point of no return, the sound fades, and with it all sense of location. But the monad marks the seal, immediately recognizing the luminous path emerging ahead. If followed, it enters the ascending diagonal that leads to the higher debashan. From there, it will contemplate its just-finished life as a transitory mirage, integrate its lessons, and remain for the appropriate duration, free from the need for rebirth. Modern science, incapable of tracing the trace of that breath which is not air, will diagnose cardiorespiratory arrest, unaware that true breathing extends beyond the measurable electromagnetic spectrum, and without tools to capture the hyperluminal wave, will declare death, ignorant that the spiritual feast has just begun in another octave. Only trained clairvoyants perceive a thin filament of light that detaches from the cranial core and ascends with a helical impulse, resembling the trajectory of maple seeds falling, but inverted, rising rather than descending. This helical orbit is the external echo of the code imprinted by the breath seal, the trail consciousness leaves when departing, which dissolves within minutes. The more centered the practitioner was, the more vertical and rapid the ascent, the more confused, the spiral widens and drifts tangentially toward intermediate planes. For the still-living disciple, the most beneficial meditation is to safely rehearse the miniature of that definitive act. Each night before sleep, gently hold the last exhalation. Lead it to the drop of the heart and let consciousness sink into the pause preceding the next automatic inhalation. If lucidity is maintained in that gap, one will have simulated in microcosm the conscious death, and the sleep that follows will reproduce in dreamlike key the Bhakanika journey. Thus, night after night one imprints in their etheric tissues the operative memory of the transit, so that when the genuine day arrives, the act will not be unknown or terrifying, but as natural as passing from waking to sleep, with the caveat that awakening will occur in spheres of higher music. Here then is the culmination of all we have presented. Breathing was not merely living, but preparing for dying, and dying so that in new wineskins the breath is not cessation, but blowing inward a wind that will no longer return empty. The karmic chain closes or breaks at that moment. The fate of the breath endures. Therefore cherish your inspiration, dignify your exhalation, and above all, guard the last breath as one guards a rare gem. It will dictate the course of your immediate eternity. Whoever ultimately parts life as one who delivers a treasure, and not as one who discards waste, will be able to watch from the luminous shore the current of samsara without being swept away again. As the final stanza of the Tibetan Book of the Dead would say, the wind of Dharma and the wind of the world will have joined, and being one, they will blow no more.